you for joining us today for this important topic on supporting newcomer students through civic engagement in schools. We have a few housekeeping items before we get started. First off, if you need help troubleshooting during the presentation, please email us at info@brycs.org, and we'll have a program associate standing by to answer any logistical questions. We are recording and archiving this webinar, and you will receive a follow-up email after today's presentation with a link to that recording, a short evaluation, and a copy of the PowerPoint slides. You can also download a copy of the PowerPoint slides in the bottom right-hand corner of your screen. As a courtesy, the phone lines have all been muted, but you can communicate with us also via the chat box on the right. We will have questions throughout today's presentation, but we will also have a Q&A session towards the end, and we will ask that you do use that chat box to interact with us today. Any unanswered questions that we don't get to, we do have a supplemental blog on this topic, and we will direct you to that as well in the follow-up email, and you can continue the conversation there. So without further ado, I will introduce today's expert. We have Laura Gardner, who is a social worker and the founder of Gardner & Associates, Immigrants, Refugees, and Schools, which provides training, technical assistance, and consultative services to school districts and other organizations on a variety of topics related to social work, education, immigration, and refugee resettlement. She has worked for BRYCS from 2006 to 2012, where she managed technical assistance to our refugee school impact grantees. Thank you, Laura, for joining us, and I'll turn it over to you.
Great. Thank you so much, Jackie. It's so great to be back with BRYCS and to see some familiar faces on the familiar names on the attendee list. So here are our objectives for today. So we're going to objective number one is to really gain awareness of opportunities for refugee civic engagement, including interacting with the school board, okay? And then the second one is for folks to acquire information on refugee parental rights in public schools. And then we'll talk a little bit about the Every Student Succeeds Act and how it may affect refugee students and families. And so one thing I'd really like to emphasize here is that both this webinar and the accompanying blog posts were really designed with refugee community leaders, refugee, ethnic community-based organizations, and resettlement staff in mind. And so this webinar is really targeted towards those audiences. I noticed in the signups that we do have a lot of folks from school districts on today, which is totally fine, and you're of course welcome to join here, but I will be sort of prioritizing comments and questions from refugee community leaders and resettlement staff. Okay, so with that in mind, we're going to go ahead. Jackie, if you could put up the first poll so I can get a sense of who's in the audience today. So folks, if you could just click if you consider yourself here as mostly a parent or community leader in the, your refugee community, or if you're resettlement staff, or if you're an educator or another, school district employee, and then the last option would be other, which you're welcome to explain other in the chat box if you wish. We'll give you a few more seconds for that. Jackie, whenever you think there's a majority of people have selected it, you can go ahead and show the result. Okay, great. So about half of our audience today is resettlement staff, about 10% refugee parents or community leaders. Yay, you are one of the main groups I'm targeting today. We do have some educators, and then other. We have a community center coordinator, some school district staff. So yeah, feel free to chime in the chat box if you don't think we kind of covered. All right, we'll go back to the PowerPoint then. Okay, so One of the frameworks I'd like to discuss before we kind of move on today is this model by a woman named Young-Chan Han, who is in Maryland. She currently works at the Maryland Department of Education, and she is a Korean immigrant herself. And she came up with this model, these 4 levels of immigrant parent involvement. And it's a pyramid, okay? And so at the base of the pyramid, we're going to start there and kind of work up. She talks about, oops, it looks like I have the bullets a little bit mixed up. We'll just talk it through. At the base of the pyramid, we have the cultural survivors, okay? So most parents in this stage, as the name implies, survivors. A lot of folks are, newly arrived immigrants or refugees, but not always. The folks in this level are pretty focused on meeting their basic needs, and these are the folks that probably enroll their children in school with the help of relatives or bilingual friends, and in general, they really do not know how to navigate the school system, right? And then if you move up 1 level, we go to the cultural learner level, okay? And so parents in this stage, they begin to attend school functions, but with the support of interpreters or bilingual liaisons or other help. They start to get a little bit involved, but they're really heavily relying on translated documents or just staff, interpreters, bilingual parent liaisons, and that type of thing to really gain knowledge about American schools. Parents in this category, again, we're talking about the cultural learner category, the second one up, they often prefer to attend language-specific events, okay? And so they start to gain that kind of basic understanding of how American schools work. If we go up to the 3rd level of the pyramid, we get to cultural connectors, okay? And parents in this stage, they really start to figure out how our schools in the United States, and then of course how their particular district and child school, how that all works. They may still use interpreters, but they're more easily navigate the school system, and they're comfortable attending, events that are in English. Again, maybe with an interpreter, maybe not, but they feel more comfortable. And most importantly, they tend to encourage and empower the people in the previous levels that we discussed. So those cultural connectors, they're out there usually kind of rallying the troops and advocating for the cultural learners and the cultural survivors. And then the top level that Young-Chan Han talks about is the cultural leaders. So these folks in this stage, not only are they knowledgeable about their child's school, but they usually start to figure things out really well at the district level, that kind of central office level. And they may be, involved in leadership opportunities on PTA or other different parent-teacher organizations, school improvement teams, so on and so forth. And they are the folks that are often communicating the needs of immigrant families to school district staff, to teachers, to principals. They're kind of that outspoken person, right? And so today I'm really targeting those cultural leaders and the cultural connectors a little bit too, but really folks that are a little bit more at the top end of the pyramid. There's lots to say about programming and staffing and initiatives for parents that are more newly arrived or in kind of that survival mode. That could be an entirely different webinar, and most webinars and trainings on working with immigrant families tend to be more for parents in that category, I'll say, or that level. There's less out there on really thinking through parents in this kind of leadership lens. Okay, so I'm going to go on to the next slide. Okay, so we're going to talk about parental rights in public schools, okay? The first one, which I imagine the chat box may blow up. So the right to receive information in a preferred language, okay? So many of us, well, some of you may not know that that's actually a parental right. Some of you do know and are probably thinking, my school district does not do that in my local hometown. Let me back up a little bit and explain a little bit of the basis for this. So this started off back when we had this, Title VI of the Civil Rights Act of 1964, where that law really prohibited discrimination on the basis of race, color, or national origin, okay? And so national origin includes language access, interpretation, and translation, okay? And so after the Civil Rights Act of 1964, fast forward to another key, I guess, directive, or here it was an executive order. It was called 13166 in the year 2000, and that didn't really actually create any new obligations. It just clarified existing Title VI responsibilities. And so it goes through reasonable steps to ensure that clients in federally funded programs, that's another key here, federally funded programs, so school districts all have some federal funds, and it talks about how those federally funded programs have to provide meaningful access to their clients in a language that they understand. Okay? Now, one of the things that Jackie just pushed out in the chat box is in 2015, some of you may remember there was a really crucial fact sheet that was created by the U.S. Department of Education and the Department of Justice. And they included there in the chat box the link to it in English, but more importantly, it also exists in other languages. And so that's something that I would strongly encourage resettlement staff to share with parents, other folks, just to, community leaders, share that information around your community, make sure that parents understand that they have that right. Now, I already know what you're thinking. You're like, that is so far from the reality in my school district, and I know, as a country, we're pretty far from where we need to be on this. I know a lot of school districts are headed in the right direction, but let's take a look what you think. So in the chat box, if you could chime in and let me know, and a little more than just yes or no, does your school district, wherever area of the country you live in, typically provide parents with information in a language they understand? And how do they do it? Do they contract out to a translation company? Do they bring in interpreters for parent-teacher conferences? Do they have parent liaisons that speak the languages of the various communities? What are the ways in which they do this? Or, chime in if they also don't do this. Okay, we have some school districts do, but most of them don't, I know. Lots of people are typing now. Okay, we have contracts, bilingual staff at school sites, Transact, yes, that's a translation or a program that provides a lot of translated documents. It depends on the school, interesting. I haven't seen any papers, okay, translated to bring home, but we do hire interpreters to give verbal messages, okay. We've got, okay, large district, about 25 students, Spanish-speaking staff, okay, which that gets a little tricky, right? Because then you have all the Spanish-speaking staff that suddenly become automatically interpreters, even if that's not necessarily their job. Language, okay, demand translation, family liaisons, okay. Okay, one of our school districts has a refugee center, this is great, through a refugee school impact grant, and has some interpreters hired specifically for schools. However, yes, there are languages that are very difficult to find interpreters for. Okay, so we are a little bit all over the board. We have some folks saying our school district, yes, has interpretation and translation services or even a department. Some people are saying, yes, but it's limited for certain languages. Ooh, here's an interesting one. After a local advocacy legal firm sued the local district, the school is doing it in Central Ohio. Yes, so a lot of times it takes, this is why we're doing this for refugee parent community leaders, not to say, I'm not saying go out and sue, but I'm saying it often takes community leaders going to the superintendent or the school board, or just keep at, they have to keep at it, keep mentioning, hey, there's this responsibility, this requirement, how can we partner together to do this? Especially for some of the more challenging languages to find, refugee community leaders are going to be key in that. Okay, so let's keep going for now. And again, we're going to do this chatting back and forth throughout, and then towards the end, we'll kind of have like an overall Q&A. Okay. All right, so another parental right right that parents have in public schools is this idea that they have the right to weigh in on school board policies and regulations, okay? And so, every public school district in the country has a school board, and every school board has a process in place for developing policies and regulations and procedures. And that includes collecting parent and community input. So just to give you some examples, especially for folks who are on the call who are more from the resettlement or community leader standpoint and you don't work in a school district, I'll just give you some examples. School boards are regularly seeking input on policies related to bullying, school climate, cultural competency, equity, language programs, lots of things that I know that refugee parents and community leaders would like to chime in on or have lots of great input and feedback on. But so you've got to know how to do that. And so there's a couple ways when parents or community members want to provide input. It's typically online or it's in person, okay? And so the online option, it may be a little difficult for non-English speakers or those without access to technology. Usually, in my experience, providing in-person feedback through an interpreter during board meetings, not only is it easier for the parent, but it's more effective. If you're a board member sitting there listening to a parent share a story or a problem or provide their input on something through an interpreter, and everybody's waiting to hear, the interpretation going back and forth and that kind of thing, it's really, really powerful. Somebody's asking, I do want to jump in. Somebody asks right now, do these parental rights apply to parents who do not have documentation? Yes, because in school districts, it's against federal law to actually ask immigration status. And so while some immigrant parents will end up disclosing just of their own accord, to a social worker or to somebody they trust, they may end up sharing that they happen to be undocumented. But when you're registering or enrolling, that should never be a question. So it should not be in their file anywhere. In theory, no one knows that. No one knows what their status is anyway, again, unless they just happen to tell you. Okay, I'm just skimming through still translation interpretation. Okay, all right, so that right to weigh in on the school board policies and regulations. So you want to be thinking about that, and I cannot overstate the importance of having parents and community leaders come and actually speak and share. There's lots of decisions being made in small rooms with school boards that frankly don't usually represent the community. And I mean that in terms of like how many immigrants or refugees are on school boards across the country. Unfortunately, not a ton. So they may not always be representing, what you want to see. And so you have to go and share your input. Okay, and going along those lines, parents have a right to provide input on their school district's budget and how funds are spent. So every school district has some kind of annual process in place for developing their budget. And, every budgets are really different across the country. Nearly every school district receives some federal and state funding, but usually around half of the district's budget comes from local funds. Typically, that's property taxes. It may be somewhat difficult to have an impact on the overall amount of money that a district has to work with, but it is quite easy to share one's opinion on what that money should be spent on, okay? And so you really want to learn about how the school district budget is created in your area. I know in a lot of the larger districts, like some of the ones I've worked for before, it really is a full year-long process where the higher-ups are starting to collect input in the fall about what they want for the entire following school year. And you've got to find the right access point. Is it going to be going to a public budget hearing? Is it writing letters? Is it writing an email? Is it a phone call? Is it a meeting? And oftentimes on school districts' websites, if you click on wherever there's more information about the actual school board, or sometimes there'll even be a separate page for the budget. Really depends on the size of your district and how kind of intricate your website is, but you can find more information and ask questions on when are those times and when are the times to provide input and how. And I will emphasize again that you may provide your input in whatever language you want. So this almost never happens. Personally, when I worked in a school district, I would have loved to have seen this happen. More parents writing in their input on a grading policy in Mandarin. Then it would have been my job to go track down somebody who could actually, read it and then submit, send it up to the school board. But that's the kind of thing that makes change or creates change. Okay. All right. So with that in mind, especially for you, maybe resettlement staff or refugee community leaders, or really anyone on the call here, have you ever spoken in front of your local school board or reached out to share your opinion on a policy or the budget? And in what capacity did you do so? If you have not done this, why? Was it that you didn't know you could? Was it you were too nervous? What was the... So go ahead and put in the chat box. We've got 5 people typing now. Didn't know how to do it. Okay. I know before I ever worked in the central office, I didn't know that either. So this is partly why we're doing the webinar. Not knowing the system, okay? A shared community support letter sent to the school board on suggestions for a new magnet refugee program. Okay, so somebody did do a letter. Okay. Emily used to be, are you still a middle school teacher, Emily, or you used to be? Okay, someone here says, yes, after doing so repeatedly, slow change has happened. Yes, that's what we like to see. Okay, I did not know how to do it with enough English to understand. Okay. Okay, I assume everyone else is reading some of the comments. Yes, Claudia is mentioning that some staff members worry about bringing things up at the school board and facing repercussions. Yes. Yes, this is why, for all of you who are employed by school districts out there, this is very much trickier. As a school district employee, sometimes you really can't do this process. This is why, well, talk to your supervisors. I mean, it's not an easy answer. Technically you cannot be told that you can't participate in democracy, but again, you're working for the people who are putting on these meetings. So you're in a completely different role. My advice today is I'm really gearing it towards those community leader folks and the resettlement agencies, because this is why, just like Claudia said, it's very tricky. Even though you have your ESSA department or your family engagement office or people that very much perhaps are like advocates of your community, or they're partners, everything's great, they can't really say anything. They're working for the system. It's very hard for them to step up and be in that situation. And so it's extra important that the community leaders and parents and community partner organizations come out and speak up, because you guys can do it. The people who are working in school districts usually cannot. Okay, I'm reading some more of the comments. Way too scary to go as a non-tenured teacher. Right, again, not necessarily suggesting it for those of you who are employed with school districts. But if you kind of make sure, I know one way, I'm not going to get into this too much today, but one of the ways, one of the districts that I used to work in, we had an immigrant parent leadership academy that was pretty high level. Again, when we go back to the pyramid, this was for parents that were kind of in that 3rd and 4th tier who were already more or less involved in their child's school, and then we're really seeking to understand how the district worked at a very high level. And we brought in immigrant parents. They got to meet the superintendent and board members and department heads and different folks. And those parents, once they knew how to work or how the system worked, they were really able to go back and share information with their communities more along these lines. And those tended to be the parents who would come and speak at board meetings. Okay, I'm just still reading through some comments here. Okay, thank you guys for your input. And thanks for pointing out, again, I know there's that tension with the staff, which is why we have to empower parents as much as possible. And the message is stronger from parents anyway. All right, so other opportunities for refugee parents and community leaders. So, you know, there's always some kind of curriculum committee going on, okay? So it could be, you know, reviewing the math curriculum, social studies, you know, whatever folks are reviewing at the time. And those committees always include parents or community members, or should, I should say. You know, I would love to see more resettlement staff or community leaders apply to join these types of committees, because think about it. I mean, really, anyone's perspective that I mentioned could be helpful on any of these committees, but particularly when we're thinking about social studies, you know, history, geography, global studies, we're talking about language learning, we're talking about literature. There's so many topics that would be so helpful to have more global voices, more diverse voices on. Then you get into the diverse workforce committees. So there are loads of studies that show that the majority of teachers in the United States are still white females, okay? But yet, the majority of students in the United States are students of color, are non-white. And lots of school districts have task forces and committees and all sorts of, committees. I'll just say committees. Committees in place to really strategize and think through how they can hire a more diverse teaching force, more diverse group of, principals, social workers, you name it. But they often don't know how to do it. They don't necessarily have that reach into the various communities. And so what a great opportunity to get some more immigrant and refugee community leaders on those types of committees so they can say, oh, hey, by the way, in our Chinese community, we communicate on that online platform called WeChat. Let me just shoot a message out to the community or my group of people, and it'll go out to like 50 families. And, you know, HR is going to say, oh, I didn't even know we had that. You know, there's all sorts of communication platforms that the different immigrant and refugee communities use, right? And so helping folks in HR or other departments who may not know how to really reach out and connect with those communities. And then school improvement committees. So most schools have in place some kind of school improvement plan. So it's probably called something different depending on your district, but these are the plans that schools put together to create goals towards improving students' academic achievement. And so these committees, they often brainstorm ways to increase family engagement, but sometimes the committees don't include families. So we got to get more families and parents on there to help, you know, brainstorm and gather ideas on more ways to involve the parents themselves. And these committees are always stronger with the voices of parents from the communities that school serves. Okay. Oh, and then the last one, just some school districts have just plain old, like literally parent and community committees. So they might be a committee to meet with board members or the superintendent, or it might be some kind of like work group or task force. It really just depends. But I strongly encourage folks to, consider joining one of these types of committees or finding out a little bit more about it. Okay, so chat box again. I'd like to ask, have you ever participated in one of these types of committees? What was your experience like? And if you have not, why not? Got some folks typing now. If everyone could just turn to the chat box. I'd love to hear if you've ever participated in some type of committee. Again, it could be a curriculum committee, committee on trying to hire more diverse teachers and staff. Got a couple people typing now. We'll give you guys a few minutes. Okay. Someone was on their committee for developing their district's writing curriculum. Okay, yes, but it's time consuming. Yeah, that many immigrants and refugee communities don't have. Can be true. Oh, great. Okay, someone else is working on a equity leadership team. Very time consuming. Okay. Title I committee. Okay. Right. Some committees can be intimidating for outsiders, right, to trying to get integrated in the communities. Right. Again, this is not for like your newly arrived immigrants and refugees. This is for, you know, it's kind of funny when we're talking about these committees, because that pyramid model that was developed by the woman Young Chan Han that I mentioned earlier, she actually developed that model, and the Immigrant Parent Leadership Academy that grew out of it, it came simply because she had such a hard time trying to find parents from the different communities to join a committee. And they were like, what's a committee? What do you want us to do? What do we do there? We have no idea. And so she tells this whole funny story when she talks about the development of the model. But so she really put together this model that's now kind of circulating through Maryland. Lots of school districts in Maryland are doing it, but again, it's this developing a leadership academy, so parents that have a lot of potential in that area can kind of learn more about how the school district works at a fairly high level, and kind of where they themselves or other members in their community can kind of, you know, insert themselves. Okay, somebody put, no, was unaware this is available to people outside the school system. It should be, and if it's not, this is another opportunity to chime in and say, hey, you know, let's say, for example, I don't know, we, in one district I worked in, we had a really large Vietnamese community. And then they're, you know, in the social studies curriculum talking about the Vietnam War. Well, what a great opportunity for a Vietnamese refugee to come in and talk about, if they're comfortable, of course, which we had some parents that wanted to, comfortable and come and talk a little bit about their experience. Or, you know, you have lots of refugees coming over now from the Congo, French speaking, right? What about all the students learning French? There's another opportunity. There's lots of opportunities for parents to kind of come in and, well, it could be a one-time thing, or in these cases, chime in on some of the curriculum and the other opportunities. Okay, some other people, interesting. Somebody says advertising for these engagement opportunities is pretty non-existent. Right. Okay. All right, well, this is helpful. Okay. All right, and now, let's see. Let's talk a little bit about the Every Student Succeeds Act. And for those of you that are more on the resettlement side of things, you're going to hear people say ESSA. That's the acronym, ESSA, okay? And so ESSA, what this is it reauthorized the Elementary and Secondary Education Act, and it replaced No Child Left Behind. So I know No Child Left Behind was fairly common lingo years ago. Most people kind of remember hearing about that, even if they're not in education. And so that's out, ESSA's in, okay? And so it was signed into law back in December of 2015, and states have all submitted their accountability plans to the U.S. Department of Education. And Jackie, who's actually under the name, you see John Galata there, she just pushed out a link that it goes through the different ESSA plans by state. So again, if you, particularly for those of you not in education, if you have no idea what I'm talking about and you're like, oh, okay, I want you to go take a look at that link later today and pull up your state plan and see a little bit about what your state has been proposing and putting together. And so in ESSA, the Every Student Succeeds Act, there is an increased emphasis on family and community engagement, particularly with those learning English. So this is a big win, right? Here's a chance, right? So your local school district should be reaching out to the immigrant and refugee communities more. And a couple kind of specific items that I'll share. So Title I, which is the federal funding stream for schools with lots of students in poverty. So now it requires that each district implement an effective means of outreach to parents of English learners. So that's obviously helpful to what we're talking about. And then the outreach, through this outreach, they must hold regular meetings in order to gather and respond to recommendations from parents, okay? So Title I was having lots of meetings before, and at least the districts I worked in usually did a decent job of getting interpreters, but this is saying that they really need to actually have some kind of plan specific to outreach for parents of English learners, okay? Then there's another federal funding stream called Title III. This is the funding stream that serves English learners and their families. And so now in Title III, it's saying that if you receive Title III funding, you must conduct parent, family, and community engagement activities. And then also at the state level, states must ensure that their Title III state plans have been developed in consultation with parents of English learners. Those are three areas where family engagement has kind of been beefed up, and specifically with English learners. Okay, and then I will also mention, though I am less of an expert on this part, there has been a lot added in terms of English learners. So if you are, community leader, you guys are gonna start seeing all of this really trickle down, because this school year that starts next month is the first year that ESSA is going to be implemented at the district and school level. It's all been at the kind of the state level up until now, okay? And so I'll just share a little bit about what's happening so far with ESSA in terms of English learners. So a big piece is that the accountability for English learners has moved from Title III to Title I. Okay, again, might be a little too nuanced for some of you that are more in the resettlement world, but I will just say that in many cases, there are districts that have a team both at the central office and the school level of Title I folks that maybe don't have as much expertise when it comes to working with English learners, immigrants, and refugees. And so there may be some opportunities in there also for professional development, where I know I've seen, I think even in the comments earlier I saw something, but I know I've seen over the years some great examples of resettlement agencies going and doing professional development and training for teachers to better understand the backgrounds of students and their families. So there's probably some opportunities for that. And then also now with ESSA is schools have to demonstrate that they're improving the English language proficiency of their English learners. It really is a measurement now of school quality. And so that's really changed too. There's some other differences. I probably won't get into those unless they come up more in the chat box. But take a look at your ESSA plan by state, and I'd encourage any community leaders on the call, parent or community leaders, have a meeting, set up a meeting with someone in central office, and find out a little bit more about how ESSA is going to be implemented in your district or your area of the country. Okay, so there's our chat again. So let's head over to the chat box. What have you heard about ESSA? Have you read your state plan? And are there ways in which school districts, refugee resettlement agencies, and refugee communities themselves can collaborate to achieve its goals? So I'd love it if you guys could chat so we can learn from each other. Got a few people typing. I'm curious, as they're typing out, I had a meeting with a number of state refugee coordinators. Every state has their own state refugee coordinator, and so this was a meeting when I was doing some work for BRYCS, and many of the state refugee coordinators had never heard of the Every Student Succeeds Act. So we all kind of operate in our silos, and so I'm trying to kind of bring folks together here and to let those of you in the resettlement side of things kind of know that this is like a huge thing going on in education now. Okay, we have one, no, I've not heard about it. This is new to me, I've not heard about it. Okay, well, I feel happy to help explain? You know, it's really big. You guys who haven't heard of it before, you probably remember No Child Left Behind, or at least hearing about it in the news, right? I would imagine. So this is like the new No Child Left Behind, right? Okay, Claudia's sharing. It seems like there was a lot of talk about ESSA when it first came out, and a lot of talk at the district level, but I'm concerned that a lot of teachers that I've talked to haven't heard of it or don't know more than the acronym. Okay, yeah, I've seen that too, Claudia. It'll be interesting to see how it really does get implemented at the school level this year. Okay, I've never heard about ESSA. Families. Okay. So someone else asks, how is this related to IDEA, or is it? IDEA is definitely still around. That's the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act. That mandates everything around special education. And so I'm no lawyer. I am not an education lawyer, but I believe the correct answer would be to say that it's separate. I mean, IDEA governs special ed. ESSA, again, is kind of the current version of the Elementary and Secondary Education Act, which oversees, like I mentioned, that Title I, Title III. There's other titles, too, that have to do with, like, training for teachers. Let's see, what else is people saying here? Okay, someone chimes in about, yeah, and the new law, they like the autonomy that districts are given to exit students. Okay, who may not test well. Right, if you want to learn more about the nuances of ESSA, particularly with English learners, like if you go to, we could send a couple more links around maybe in a follow-up email, but the Migration Policy Institute has been doing some great work in this area, and they have, I wonder if I could type it in the chat box. It's called Analyzing State ESSA Plans for English Learner Accountability. And they created this framework for community stakeholders. So it's kind of looking at families and communities and saying, here's a list of kind of like what you need to look for and what you need to ask. Oh, okay, cool. They put the link up. Awesome. And then also for Migration Policy Institute, they also have a document called Facts About English Learners and the NCLB, which used to be No Child Left Behind, /ESSA Transition in Select States. And I think if I remember, I was looking at it last night, there's about 10 states they highlight there, and what did No Child Left Behind used to say, and what is ESSA saying now. And again, if we, oh look, they found it again. Perfect. Thanks, Jackie. And yeah, the idea, I'm reading some of the comments, the main idea, like the big idea behind ESSA is that it kind of pushes back to the state level some of the decisions that need to be made about like how quickly schools must improve and how states can intervene with struggling districts. So some people think education, you know, should be more federal, some people want it to be more state, and so we're kind of, it's a pendulum, and we're kind of now back more on the state level. Okay, here's a great question. How do you recommend letting schools or principals know about these requirements without it seeming like you are threatening them or forcing them to do something? Yeah, that's a great question. I think some of it, well, Stacy, would you mind clarifying your role? Are you asking this as more of a parent or a community leader or resettlement? Or are you, if you're an employee, my answer would be totally different. But I'm going to assume you're not an employee. I think it probably depends really partly on your existing relationship with those people, if you have an existing relationship with those people. If you do, for example, with some principals, setting up a meeting, I mean, I'd find it very hard to believe that a principal will not have at least know the basics around ESSA. I mean, it's kind of been all over the place in the education world. I'm not surprised if teachers are kind of just doing their thing and haven't heard about it as much. But so if you know the principal, maybe setting up a meeting and just to kind of say, hey, I wanted to learn more about the Every Student Succeeds Act and kind of hear how this is coming down the pike and what you guys are doing. If you don't have a relationship with the principal, again, I'm not sure what your role is, but if you were resettlement and you're not in like a huge district, I would probably set up a meeting with someone at the central office to find out a little bit more big picture rather than going to specific principal by principal. That's my thought. So if anyone else has some thoughts, please chime in on that. Yeah, meeting with the ELL director, that would be great too. What other thoughts do you guys have for Stacy? And again, Stacy, if you can, type in your role so we're clear on which kind of lens you're coming to with this question. We've got a bunch of people typing. Oh, great. School Impact Program Specialist. Okay, a caseworker was asking the question. Okay, so Stacy, I don't know how long you've been in your role, but I would imagine you probably have, if you've been in the role for at least a couple years, I would imagine you have some relationships with kind of central office people. So I would actually probably start there, and not in a, I don't know how to explain it, not like a threatening kind of way, just like a, hey, I was on this webinar and I heard about this whole new ESSA thing. Like, can we sit down and talk about it and find out how it's going to impact our kids and families and our clients? Okay, great. We have Deborah. Okay. Okay. All right, so now we're basically going to go into kind of just the open conversation session. I'd be happy to loop back to any of the topics. As I suspected, kind of the interpretation translation ones seem to have the most comments. And Jackie, if you saw any questions that were flying by, like some really great questions that I missed, please find a way to highlight those for me, either, you know, sharing them out loud or whatever the easiest way. All right, I like Emily's here. Right, ask questions before making recommendations, right? It's going to be, right, it's new for everybody right now. And so I think it's a great time with, you know, new requirements related to English learners, new requirements related to family engagement, or not, you know, edited, not like brand new, but tweaked. And so what a great time to kind of open up some more conversations about partnerships. Oh, okay. Can I please recap really quickly what Title I has to do with the population? Sure. So again, so Title I, that is the federal funding source that covers schools that are working with students in poverty. It's handled differently depending on where you are in the country, but usually schools will look at the number of kids who have free and reduced lunch, like when they fill out the free and reduced lunch application. And in some districts, a lot of districts, they name it by school. So maybe, you know, a third of their elementary schools are designated Title I schools, and those schools get additional funds to support those students. So a lot of times those schools will hire, it could be additional like reading specialists, math specialists, people to do little pull-out groups with kids. Sometimes they hire more social workers. Sometimes they hire more family engagement staff. But so obviously not all refugees and immigrants are poor by any means, but like a lot of times it kind of overlaps because a number of immigrants and refugees are dealing with poverty. And so but that funding source does come into play when we're talking about schools. Okay, let me read Leslie's comment. It's one thing to let parents know what is happening with their student and school, but how about the challenge for some parents to act on this information, like signing their kids up for activities or school conferences? Leslie, can you tell me a little bit more about what you mean and what your role is? Oh, okay. Well, Leslie, while you type up more info, I'm going to answer this other question. Coralie, if I'm pronouncing it right, could we get more information about the 4 levels of immigrant parent involvement and how we can move parents from one level to the next? Yes, that's a great question. So I will talk a little bit more about that. So at that foundational, I will talk a little bit about the survival level because I think that that's also very crucial. So at that survival level, a lot of times the ways that school districts support families in that level is through some kind of bilingual parent liaison, okay? Everybody calls it something different. I know when I used to work at BRYCS, I think I had probably 8 or 9 different ways that the school districts I was working with were calling it. Some were saying cultural broker, some were saying community navigator, family, school liaison, homeschool liaison, you get it, right? So not all districts have that, but a lot do because it's that hands-on person that can help families in that kind of survival mode just begin to navigate the school system, and they can help with the interpretation and translation piece. At that level, often school districts will use their Title III funding to provide workshops for parents, and with usually just kind of some really preliminary, basic information, especially for some of our refugee families who have come from more rural areas or have been in refugee camps for years. Just knowing the basics, like school buses are yellow, like here's what does a principal do? What does a teacher do? What does a school counselor do? You know, some of the basic orientation kinds of information, and then after a while, again, you kind of, at least from when I've worked in schools, after a while, you kind of start to figure out maybe who's interested or who's kind of getting it, who has great relationships with other parents too, and you can usually start getting them into that kind of second level. Some of this is very strategic and planned. Some of it is more, I guess, fluid and just sort of happens. But I will say that the team that I used to work on, we used to print out a blank pyramid at the beginning of every school year and really think through, of all of our programming, which level did it fall in on the pyramid? So we made sure that we sort of accommodated parents that were in those various levels. And I always felt like we did a pretty good job with parents in survival mode and in the cultural learner mode. Because again, we were always doing workshops and things of that sort, but getting them from kind of that second to that third level, that was where our gap was. We seemed to not ever quite do the best job in that. And then in the fourth level was primarily we got them there through that leadership academy that I mentioned, where we would bring them to the central office for like 6 weeks, once a week for 6 weeks, and really explain kind of how the system works. Okay, Leslie's a resettlement director. So let me go back to your question. Right, the challenge for some parents to act on this information, right. I mean, I think, Leslie, that if we're talking about the real basics of signing up their kids for activities or school conferences, it sounds like their parents with those struggles would be in a little bit more of kind of that survivor or cultural learner level, and that they, maybe some of the advocacy that needs to happen is if your district doesn't have any kind of parent liaison, that's the kind of thing that usually parent liaisons would help them with when they need hand-holding to sign up for like a parent-teacher conference or things like that. I don't know if I answered your question. Feel free to type more. Oh, and while she's writing that, oh, that's helpful to see the disconnect. Okay. And let's see, Emily asks, why do I think they would, or any thoughts on why they would pass ELL improvement to Title I? My understanding is that for most people in kind of the ELL, English learner world, they see this as a good thing because it's just making schools overall more accountable for English learners, more visible. If anyone else wants, again, that little niche there is not that's not my area of expertise. So if anyone else wants to chime in, but that's what I've heard. what other thoughts or questions do you guys have? Yeah. Coralie wants some more information and materials during your workshop for level 1 and 2 in the Leadership Academy. Sure, yeah. For any questions, if you, Jackie, I assume you'd want to email info@brycs.org.
Yeah, that would be great.
Okay. So Jackie can just type, well, I think we have it on the next, there we go, the next slide. So just the info@brycs.org. A lot of that type of thing is in the BRYCS Clearinghouse. There, for any of you who have not ever gone to the BRYCS Clearinghouse, there's something like 8,000 or more resources at this point. There's a lot of great curricula related to family engagement and parent involvement in there. And then also, I mean, if you kind of want that particular Leadership Academy I was talking about, I'm sure Jackie can maybe forward that on or forward it to you. Okay, Jackie, do you see any other questions that I've missed?
No, I think you did a great job.
Okay, I'm just skimming through here. All right, any final questions? We've just about wrapped up our hour together. If any other final questions come in.
I'll jump in here and just say for the folks asking for recordings, yes, all registrants receive a follow-up email with a link to the recording, a copy of the slides. We'll include the links here that we shot out in the chat box throughout the presentation, and there'll be a short evaluation as well that we would appreciate your feedback on, and we hope to have that to you by Monday.
Great. Well, thank you, everybody, for your input. You gave me a lot to think about, too. And I look forward to, you know, probably seeing some follow-up emails from a number of you.
Great. Thanks so much for your time, Laura. We appreciate it. And
yeah, thanks for inviting me. All right, take care, everybody.